The last time we potted, we were wondering if the Celtics were going to show up for Game 5 of the finals. It seems like a million years ago. There's been a Game 5 title win, a parade, some really fun Celtics moments. We're not going to talk about the Celtics. We're going to look forward. We're going to talk about the draft, some trade rumors we heard. We have a bunch of fun topics. We're going to do a little Oilers-Panthers Game 7 near the end. You finally caught up on the Karen Reed trial, so I'm excited for this one. We're going to start with a zag. Paul George. Some smoke now as we do this on a Sunday that maybe he's not going to be on the Clippers next year. And as always with this stuff, I cannot tell what's real and not real. I just know that there's a bunch of teams now that feel like they might have a chance, whether to sign him outright or to maybe trade for him or whatever. And people are looking at the Clippers. What are they thinking? They've never made the finals with Paul George. Are they going to pay Kawhi and Harden and Paul George all this money? Paul George heading into year 15, all the stuff we talked about in the past. What's your shit detector level for this story? Because it could always just be the posturing and it ends up he just signs with the Clippers. He also has his own podcast. He has CAA behind him. They love to create some drama as we head into events. So I'm cautious, but I do feel like he's the biggest domino right now. So what are you thinking about it?
Yeah, a lot to get to with this one. I thought it was interesting that on his podcast, he talked about how Harden told him Daryl Morey's a liar and players talk. And I was like, you realize you're hurting your own leverage option here by saying
with the team that has the most leverage for you to use.
I know we're getting into this, but like there's been a lot of slip ups lately with all of this access that we have to players. Like I thought there was one that I sent you where Rich Paul was doing this really front-facing media thing about Bronny James. And like, well, maybe Minnesota, who likes him, but we don't know what the ownership's going to be. I'm like, I don't know if that's like the number one thing for Bronny at this stage. Of like, is your ownership secure?
Yeah.
He talked about Toronto and Masai being an uncle and all this stuff. But I thought it was really interesting when he said, hey, if this was about him playing with LeBron, then we just forced the Lakers to take him at 17. And I went, that's a slightly different tune than when you tell us all the time that LeBron has nothing to do with front office stuff, has nothing to do with the coach. And it was a very straightforward, we'd tell the Lakers to do this. And I went, well, wait, that's the exact opposite tone of everything you said. So anyway, back to the Paul George thing. I love all the access because we get some different thoughts on it. I think it's pretty clear, Bill, and you'd probably agree that he's not been happy about this negotiation for a long time. Like I'm sure he and CAA felt like, okay, the 4-year max, like this is who I am. This is what I'm going to do. I know Kawhi took a little bit less, but I'm just supposed to get that. It's Ballmer. I'm just supposed to get that. And clearly that's not what the Clippers want to do with him. So this has been a long-standing thing because it could have already been done. And clearly the Clippers don't want to just hand him the blank check that you're supposed to get for the 4-year max.
I can't tell how much of this is we don't want to do anything different for you than we already did with Kawhi. How much of it is, well, Kawhi, Harden, Paul George, second apron. It's starting to get a little scary. Let's see how this plays out for 3 years instead of 4. Or the Clippers are looking at it going, we kind of didn't win anything with this nucleus. Maybe we have a chance to turn the asset. The team that has been floating around, and I don't know how real it is, but I think there's an equal sense of desperation on their side as Golden State. Because Golden State, and it's been reported, people know about it, but I actually feel like it should be the top story. Anytime we're talking trades, it should be the first thing mentioned. Golden State with this situation they have with Chris Paul's contract. So on June 28th, they either have to guarantee Chris Paul's contract for next season, which is $30 million, or they have to buy it out for $5 million. So it's still a trade asset. The problem is you can't trade him this week, and then the new team can say, oh, cool, we'll just waive Chris Paul's contract and we'll wipe that $30 million off the books. The contract has to be guaranteed by the new team. But the Clippers, who are a second apron team, and it gets really hard to make trades with second apron teams. The Warriors would also be a second apron team if they kept Klay Thompson. But if they get rid of Klay Thompson, all of a sudden they're not. Which means that there's 2 possible Clipper trades that they could do for Paul George. One is they could combine Chris Paul, that contract, Clippers would have to guarantee it next year, with Kuminga, with Gary Payton for Paul George. The other one is you take Chris Paul with Draymond Green, you trade him the Clippers, and they send back Paul George and PJ Tucker. And I think they could do that. If they can't, then we only have the first option. But that is how the Warriors can get Paul George. They would have to basically guarantee Chris Paul's contract next year. And then they would have to make it work with like Kuminga and Peyton and make it so that it is almost exactly where Paul George's salary is. And then it works. Tell me if you agree with me. If you're Golden State, like you have this once in a generation ticket with Curry. Are you really going to waste that? Like, are you just going to say, we had a good run. We won in 22. Now let's have the mid 2010s Kobe retirement tour for the rest of the decade, basically. I don't think they want that. I don't think he wants that. So I'm watching them the most with trade week here. How about you?
Yeah. Look, you can not want a lot of things. It doesn't mean you get those things. And I'd agree with you that they probably owe it to Steph more than any franchise owes a single player in the NBA of like, look, you're still really good. And there's a 2-year window. That's its own topic of like, how's that going to look? Are they just going to extend them and then go, we never want you in another uniform, even though we know long term we might not even have enough around you. And then maybe that leads to all different stuff that we're speculating on. Again, we've got time for that one. But it's funny because in the past, like Paul George was offered for Klay Thompson when he was still with the Pacers. Kevin Pritchard was offering Paul George everywhere. And even if you, at that time, I think the consensus would have been, okay, wait, Paul George is better than Klay Thompson. But what you're doing is you're trading your non-problem for the Paul George problem. Well, fast forward a bunch of years, and if you look at the Warriors situation, like there's all these players. We could talk about Jimmy Butler. We could talk about Paul George. There's some lesser people like Levine or Kuzma or whatever. It's like, well, how do we, if you're the Warriors, how do we raise just our level of talent? Doesn't guarantee us anything. Paul George may not even fit our movement and all the stuff that we're doing, but based on the options and what we'd have to actually invest in the player on top of everything else, whether it's a Butler extension or a Paul George extension, at this point, I think you're so desperate with where you are and the limitations you have financially, the lack of assets around the people that you don't want to even move, where it probably starts to make a little bit more sense because now you're not looking at yourself as some perfect engine where you don't want a non-Golden State Warrior type basketball player to disrupt what you're doing. You're looking for anybody to be just way better than what your second or third options have been. And that leads to the Klay decision that they're going to have to make. Like when you mentioned Chris Paul and Draymond, I don't think you have to give up that much because George is going to be able to say, look, much like the Chris Paul scenario in 2017 with the Clippers going to the Rockets, you can either trade me to this team, which I'll opt in and then get an extension later, or you're going to lose me for nothing.
Well, we saw Philly have that with Harden, right? Harden could have opted out for free agency. We didn't have the same kind of teams with cap space that we do this year. But he opts in, and then it's like, yeah, trade me. And what does Philly end up with? They end up with Batum and Covington, and they get a couple picks, and that was it. I think they got less than maybe they were hoping. I think the Paul George thing's a little different because there's more suitors for him, right? Like, it's not just Golden State. I think the Lakers, like, what if, is there a possible LeBron, Paul George swapperoo? Is that conceivable? I don't know. Like if you're Ballmer, could you get super excited about that because you got the arena open up, you didn't, and you just flip those guys? Maybe you even give more assets for that. If you're the Rockets,
do you think the Lakers would want LeBron in a Clippers uniform, even if it meant Paul George?
I don't know what they meant. This is the same franchise that put out like a 2-sentence farewell to Jerry West, who was one of the greatest Lakers of all time. They're like, Jerry was a very valuable person. Thank you. We're going to miss him. Houston, I just think they're in play for anybody at anything because of all the they're the most 3-for-1 type of team we've seen in a while. And then Orlando and Philly just have the cap space to sign them. And that's the scary part if you're the Clippers. Because unlike the Harden year with Philly, it was one of those, well, where are you going to go, James? Right? Where are you getting that money? Because Dallas is re-signing Kyrie. Like we're going down the line. Who has the cap space you're looking for? Houston pivoted away from you, got Van Vliet and Brooks. You don't have the team. There are 2 teams in this case. And then 3 if he just wanted to get a lot of money from Detroit, which I don't even know if Detroit would want to do that. But the Golden State scenario, I think, is the most interesting to me.
Would you agree, though, that they probably don't have to do, like, Like if you're getting Kuminga back in this, then
Or is it a
maybe I
way to
don't.
get off Draymond? I mean, we were going to do a what would you do later with Golden State. We could just do it now because it's not that long. There's 3 paths. They could just get rid of Chris Paul, just not re-sign him. They could let Clay sign with somebody else. They could package Chris Paul with Draymond and try to trade him for Paul George or somebody like that and just try to get rid of all 3 contracts and basically just move into the next phase and just say, you know what, we built our building. We've won 4 titles. We won in 22. We're going to go with Steph and the young guys, and we're bidding goodbye to that era. Or you go the other way and you say, we're going to use this Chris Paul contract. We're going to keep paying this crazy luxury tax second apron thing that, that last year I think they set the record for the highest tax number anybody had paid. And we're just going to keep doing that because we're the Warriors and because we have Steph. And if that's the case, then use the Chris Paul thing. Because otherwise you're paying him $30 million basically to be your 9th man and to be a trade asset in February. Yeah. I don't see how they would do that.
Well, there's no way they're going to do that because they're at 174 with Chris Paul and Looney, where that option for $8+ million is tomorrow. And then that's with Santos under contract. So they're at 174.
Not even covering Clay yet.
No, that's without Clay. So the cap for next year is 141. The tax is 171.3. The first apron's 178. So as soon as you do a deal with Clay and the reported deal that he wasn't interested in, what was 2 years and $48 million. So I don't know.
Yeah, but we did this last year with Draymond where they're like, he's going to leave. It's not enough money. It's not happening. And then all of a sudden he was re-signing for 4 years. I don't trust any of the Clay reports. Do you?
Not when the numbers, like I just feel like we're hit over the head with numbers. I mean, it happens in media too with guys that do our jobs, where this number just gets floated and everybody freaks out. It's the Boris thing. You just float an absurd number. Because remember with Draymond, you're going, wait, are you really going to go 4 years, 160 for him? And then it turns out to be 3 for 100. But you probably felt better about Draymond a year ago than you feel about Clay present day, correct?
Yes. Listen, there's a scenario where they just let Clay leave and they let Chris Paul leave. And they're just like, you know what? We looked at the West, we looked at the East, we have no chance to compete against a team like Boston or wherever OKC is going, Minnesota, Dallas. We can't swim in that pool anymore, and we're trying to be realistic about it. We're not going to chase it. We didn't even make the playoffs last year. What's really going to be different for us? What could be different is if they made a huge swing at Paul George or, you mentioned a couple of those names, right? It's like Paul George and Jimmy Butler is tier A. Tier B is talking yourself into Brandon Ingram, who I think has more value than Zach LaVine, but Steve Kerr coached Brandon Ingram on Team USA, and by the end of the thing, Brandon Ingram's like, yeah, he's not going to play in the last 2 games. And Zach LaVine, where you could almost argue that's a negative asset. And then the third tier would be, let's just rebuild and just Curry will sell out the arena, and that's what we're going to do. And we have no chance to win the title. My guess is they're too competitive to do that, but that might be the smart move.
I don't know how different you'll be, though, starting the rebuild now with Steph the attraction as opposed to worrying about the Steph decision in 2 years.
Right.
See what I'm saying? You're right. Everything you said is right. But if you're on the Golden State side of it, you could probably talk yourself into a few things. You say, hey, last 50 games, they were 31-19, was the 8th best record in the NBA. From that stretch, they were 6th on offense, 16th in defense. Clay, after the All-Star break, was a better player. His shooting splits were 45-41. If you want to look at his total 2 years, he's kind of a net negative. And defensively, he's just not the same. But there was some good Clay closing months from this season in a stretch where he got benched and people were wondering what he was even going to be in the free agent market. So you also, which is a big assumption, you go, it has to be a better Draymond year, right?
Does it?
It has to be.
Does it?
Do you think it's going to get worse?
Will it be the same amount of drama that we had last year? I don't know. I wouldn't bet on it either way. I can't say that I've seen a lot of signs that it's going to be less dramatic.
It just was so dramatic. I just have a hard time believing we're going to get the exact same thing. I mean, the guy basically conned all of us into thinking that it was I'm just going to step away from the game. It was an unbelievable spin on all of this stuff. It's hey, just stop fucking punching people. And it was like, I just have to figure out
He
where I'm
does
at
not
right
seem
now.
self-aware in any conceivable way.
No.
Well, and speaking of self-aware, like one of the things they have to do with Clay, Malik Monk, who I think if you're going to compare Clay at an advancing age to different scores in the league who are a little up and down, or maybe they can't guard anybody that well and they're more consistent offensively or whatever, Malik Monk was $78 million for 4 years. Is Klay Thompson worth more than Malik Monk? I would say no. I would say that's right around his range, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, or 4. It's probably between like 17 to 20 million a year for what he is at this point of his career. The question is, does he think that? And I'm gonna guess no.
By the way, have you been watching The English Patient
No. Why?
or The King's Speech?
Why?
Just your work with Malik Monk.
Oh,
You said his name right twice.
we're all trying to get better. It doesn't matter how old you are. We're all trying to improve. I can't say Wimbledon. I still call it Wimbledon. Get ready for that with the T instead of the D.
Robert Ory's probably out there being like, why does he think I sleep around so much?
Robert, I have some bad ones. I'll fully admit it. All right, so
We all have a few. So
Your Paul George prediction is what?
Hold on. I just want to stay like on the Golden State. You're right about all of the rest of the West. Like if they're being honest, if Dunleavy and Kerr and Lakeup and they're all talking to each other and going, hey, like we're not going to be better than any of those teams. But if you wanted to have a positive day, you would say all the things I said. You go, okay, Pajemski will be better. Jackson Davis was a hit. Kuminga finally showed us some stretches of like being a real thing here. So you may not even be in a hurry to be trading him for anybody else.
Less dramatic Draymond year.
Less dramatic Draymond year. And I know what'll happen. If Chris Paul's waived and they don't get anybody, you're just going to say like, I can't believe they wasted that asset. And I'm just going to go, well, maybe Paul George can just force their hand and that leads to a Wiggins deal and a couple picks. And maybe it isn't even Kuminga. Maybe it's Looney because Jackson Davis feels like a better option there. And that's how you start adding up some of the money for it. Because when you look at the Chris Paul Houston thing, there's actually a couple decent pieces in there. It's just a lot of stuff. It was Pat Bev. It was
couple picks, right?
Yeah,
Pat
it was
Bev.
Montrez,
Yeah.
Lou Will, Sam Decker, shout out. Kyle Wiltshire, for those that want to keep track. DeAndre Liggins, and there was a first that was Spellman. So they actually like got a couple things there, but that just depends on if Paul George is going to say, hey, look, you have to trade me here. And it's not a perfect fit. It doesn't make the Warriors the favorites, although on TV for 24 hours, somebody will probably say it. And maybe that's the best case scenario of just going, we're raising our talent level, even though Paul George at 34 years old, right?
Year 15.
Played the most games he's played in 5 years. The previous 4 years, he never got north of 60 games in a season. And like for Paul George to thrive, he needs to be somebody that doesn't have all the pressure on him. And Steph would take some of that pressure away from him. I still think Philadelphia makes the most sense for him because there'll be the maxi night. Embiid's good for his 30, 15 or whatever. And Paul George can kind of just be a higher price Tobias Harris at times. But knowing that he'll also have some games where he looks like one of the 10 best players in the league. Because I do feel more comfortable about him having some of those high-level playoff games. I just don't expect to pencil him in for like 6 or 7 in a row in a long series.
Higher price Tobias Harris. I'm trying to decide how insulting that was because Tobias was making $40 million last year.
Yeah, I guess I just mean moving forward how much he's going to make.
No, I'm not. But you were right. It's like the phrase is correct. I'm like, oof. Higher price Tobias Harris, who's probably the least liked Sixer of the last since Ben Simmons.
Right. We just saw it, though, right? Against Dallas. I mean, am I unfair in saying there were moments in there where you're looking at Paul George going, hey,
caught him the coin flip,
now.
brother. No, right. I mean, it's year 15. You're not going to change that much in year 15 as a basketball player, would be my guess.
He could never go anywhere right now. Like, that's why Orlando actually probably makes a little less sense unless Paolo just takes it up to another level, which I think is totally within reason. I think Franz will just by default be a better shooter this year. But if Paul George goes to a place where he has to be the one option all the time, Maxey and Embiid take a ton of pressure off of him. Steph would. Maybe if Clay has some kind of bounce back that carries over, like could he possibly be a little bit better than he was even after the All-Star break? Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's impossible, or any of those
I actually
things.
like the fit for him on the Lakers the most. If you just flipped him and LeBron, I like that fit for him. Him playing with Davis and Rui and Austin Reeves, JJ coaching, and I don't know. I just think that would be. I think the most fun basketball trade would just be flipping LeBron and Paul George and putting LeBron on the Clippers with Kawhi and James Harden. I would just enjoy that more as a basketball fan. One last thing on Golden State. The case for them doing something with that Chris Paul contract is that we just did that Ringer Top 100 last few days ago. I had Curry 7th, and it goes back to something I'm never going to waver on. If you have a top 10 guy in the league, somebody who has a chance to be a first-team All-NBA guy, somebody who has a chance, if you have the right team, to be an MVP candidate, you kind of have to go for it. You know, this was the case for OKC with SGA last year when it was like, hey, guys, you might be a 1 seed. You have a guy who's one of the best 4 guys in the league. Like, can you take this a little more seriously? So if you're the Warriors, Steph is still at that level. And maybe he's not going to be at that level for more than a year or 2 years. I don't know. But if they can turn that Chris Paul thing into a better asset, you might have to do it, especially with the way the values of the franchises are going up. And that's probably a $7 billion team at this point.
By the way, on the LeBron front, as soon as he opts out, though, that's just not an option.
Yeah, good point. But couldn't they sign and trade him after he opts out, though? I thought they could. I'm always confused by those rules. I think they can. Once it could be like the double, whatever.